The road through the reserve shimmered under the late afternoon sun, each ripple of heat distorting the horizon into a wavering mirage, and the air was so dry it seemed to scrape at the back of the throat with every breath. Daniel had been driving for over an hour on his return from a routine patrol, his focus on the monotonous stretch of pale dirt ahead, when the steady rhythm of the road was broken by a shape lying motionless a short distance away. Its tawny hide blending so well with the dust that for a moment he thought it might be a patch of earth until the faint curve of a rib cage rising and falling caught his eye, and as he drew closer, easing his vehicle into a slower crawl, the shape resolved into the unmistakable form of a young male lion, sprawled on his side, ribs lifting in shallow rhythm, every movement labored as though even the act of breathing demanded more than the body could give. Flies crawled busily over open wounds along his flank, the raw, torn skin glistening faintly under the sun, and his mane, still thin and uneven, spoke of an age too young for the heavy authority of a mature male but old enough to have been drawn into the brutal politics of lion life. His eyes were half-lidded, their dull amber gaze fixed somewhere in the middle distance, unfocused, not tracking Daniel's slow approach, and the air around him carried the faint, sharp scent of blood beneath the hotter smells of dust and sun-baked earth, the metallic tang carried on a breeze that offered no real relief from the day's oppressive heat. Daniel stopped the vehicle a safe distance away and cut the engine, the sudden silence almost startling after the constant hum of tires and motor, then stepped out slowly, boots crunching softly in the grit, every movement deliberate, his eyes fixed on the lion's body for any sign of change. There was none, only the faint tremor in the shallow breaths and a single twitch of the tail to mark the animal as alive, and from this closer vantage point the wounds looked fresh, perhaps only hours old, likely the result of a territorial clash with another male or a violent dispute over a carcass, the deeper gash near the hip oozing dark, sluggish blood, the edges of the wound already beginning to attract a restless halo of flies that spoke of the risk that was creeping nearer with each passing hour. Daniel knew from experience that infection in these conditions moved quickly, especially in a weakened animal, and if it set in before nightfall, the odds would drop sharply against the lion surviving until morning. So he crouched at a cautious distance, keeping his shadow just shy of the lion's body, feeling the heat radiating from the baked ground in wavering lines that blurred the edges of his vision, and studied the slow rise and fall of the chest, counting the breaths. Too few, each one shallow, strained, the effort visible in the small flaring of nostrils and the faint shift of muscles under the hide. The lion's ears flicked once in irritation at a buzzing fly, but the rest of his body stayed still, the stillness of an animal on the edge, where even the instinct to move is overridden by the body's demand for stillness to conserve what little strength remains, and Daniel understood the danger. In this state, a short chase from scavengers, even the persistent harassment of a small pack of jackals, could tip the balance toward death within minutes. A breeze stirred the dry scent of acacia and dust, and Daniel's eyes traced the faint scuff marks in the dirt where the lion's paws had scraped forward in what must have been an earlier attempt to rise, the tracks ending abruptly a few meters from where he now lay, a clear story of collapse told in the shallow depressions and scattered grit, and Daniel imagined the moment, the slow, faltering steps, the growing tremble in the limbs, and then the surrender to gravity as the body simply refused to go further. Now the lion lay in full view of the road, exposed to the open plain, unable to defend himself from any threat that might come across him before the night was out, and Daniel thought of the hyenas that often moved through this area after dusk, their sharp noses leading them unerringly to weakness, and how quickly they could strip away the life of an animal already so far spent. He took a slow step closer, stopping immediately when the lion's eyes flickered fully open for the first time, the dull amber sharpening for an instant, the gaze locking with his not in any human sense of recognition but in the raw, wordless acknowledgement that exists between two living beings in the same place and moment. And Daniel lowered his voice to a near whisper, offering the soft, steady, easy now that he had used with countless wild creatures before, his tone carrying no urgency, no demand, only presence. The lion's ears shifted minutely toward the sound. But the body remained pressed flat into the dust. No attempt to rise, only the same slow rhythm of breath and the faint pulse visible in the hollow of the neck. Daniel knew the stakes. If the animal forced himself to move, the bleeding could worsen, draining what little reserve he had left, but if he stayed as he was, exposed and dehydrating under the heat, he might not live to see the cooler hours of the early morning. The choice would have to be made soon, whether to leave the lion to the harsh impartiality of the wild, or to step in before nature finished what had already begun. And while Daniel had always respected the line between intervention and letting the wild take its course, the thought of driving away now, of leaving the animal to fade into stillness alone, pressed against him like the weight of the heat itself. The lion's tail twitched again, this time slower, stirring a thin cloud of dust that drifted away on the breeze, and overhead a lone vulture traced a slow circle, riding the thermal with an almost lazy patience, the dark shape turning against the pale sky as though in casual acknowledgement of the inevitable. Somewhere beyond the low ridge to the west, the distant call of another lion carried faintly on the air, but no reply came from the one lying here, whose world had narrowed to this small patch of earth, the throbbing heat in his wounds. And the silent company of the man crouched nearby. Daniel straightened slowly, stepping back toward the vehicle, his movements deliberate and unhurried, the decision already firming in his mind before his hands reached the radio mounted beside the dashboard, and when he lifted the receiver, his voice was steady, clear, giving the coordinates and the condition of the animal, the words sparse but enough to convey urgency without panic. In the heat of the afternoon, with the stillness unbroken except for the faint sound of his own breathing, Daniel kept his eyes fixed on the lion, watching the rise and fall of the chest, counting the seconds between breaths, gauging just how close the line was to being crossed. Every minute now was part of the wound itself, a slow drain that could not be stopped without human hands and care, and he knew the day would not end before some action was taken. If help could reach them quickly enough, there was still a chance. A fragile one, but enough to fight for. Without it, the lion would be gone by dawn, another body claimed by the dust and heat, the balance between life and death so thin now it seemed to rest entirely on the time it would take for footsteps to bridge the distance between them. ChatGPT said, Daniel kept a steady distance as he moved toward the lion, each footstep placed with care so as not to startle an animal already weakened beyond the point of defense. The sun had begun its slow tilt toward evening, softening in color but not in heat, and the air hung heavy with the mingled scent of dust, sweat, and the metallic trace of blood. From this closer vantage, the injuries revealed themselves in stark detail. Deep gashes ran along the lion's flank, the edges raw and inflamed, likely torn by claws during a fight. The right rear leg lay twisted slightly outward, a limp that suggested either a joint injury or deep bruising to the muscle. Around each wound, flies moved in constant restless swarms, landing, feeding, lifting again with the smallest movement from their host. The lion's breathing was thin, a shallow flutter of the chest that spoke less of rest than of survival on the edge of collapse. His ears tilted weakly at small sounds, but the weight of his head remained pressed to the ground. Daniel could see the dried crust of earlier bleeding along the hip and the faint track of where fresh fluid had seeped into the fur. Every sign pointed to exhaustion layered over injury, a combination that would not hold long without help. He crouched, adjusting his angle to see the full length of the body, noting how the front paws still bore faint tremors as if the animal's muscles were firing in reflex to stand but failing to follow through. Small puffs of dust lifted from beneath the pads when the tail gave a slow, weary flick. In the heavy silence, the sound of each exhale was stark, a soft push of air followed by a pause that felt too long before the next intake. Daniel knew these pauses. They mark the thin space between endurance and failure. Without water, without rest free from the constant threat of scavengers, the lion would not live through the coming night. The plain facts aligned with an uncomfortable clarity. Inaction meant death, and even with intervention, the outcome was uncertain. Daniel kept his body low. Not out of fear, but respect, moving just close enough to scan the wounds for signs of deeper internal harm. The muscles on the lion's injured leg twitched faintly when Daniel's shadow crossed them, a reflexive protest at even indirect intrusion. The eyes opened for a moment, clouded yet alert enough to register proximity, and in that instant Daniel spoke softly, the words more a tone than a message. "Steady now." The ears shifted in response, but the gaze drifted away again, unfixed. No growl came, no attempt to rise, only the continued shallow breaths and the stillness of a body calculating the cost of any movement. He scanned the surrounding area for fresh tracks, piecing together the path that had brought the lion here. A faint trail of blood spots marked the dirt behind him, each one spaced in uneven intervals, suggesting moments of stumbling and halting. The injuries had been sustained not far from here, but far enough that the lion had pushed himself to this point before conceding to the ground. Daniel considered the distance back to the station and the time it would take for veterinary help to arrive. In this heat, minutes carried weight. Every moment spent here, assessing, meant another moment closer to the point where dehydration and shock could tip the balance beyond reversal. The decision was no longer a question of whether to act, but how quickly to make the first move. Leaving to fetch help alone would mean abandoning the animal in open view, vulnerable to hyenas, leopards, even opportunistic jackals. Waiting too long here meant watching the slow fade of life with no chance of recovery. Daniel weighed the options with the discipline of habit, his gaze flicking between the lion's wounds and the long, empty stretch of road. He reached for his radio, fingers moving with deliberate calm, and relayed the details. Male, young. Multiple deep lacerations to the flank, possible hind leg injury, shallow respiration, location marked by the old acacia split at the base. His voice stayed steady, each fact clear and spare, knowing urgency could be conveyed without raising its pitch. As he ended the call, Daniel glanced again at the lion. The chest rose and fell, slower now, each movement shallow but still present. A flick of the tail stirred another thin puff of dust. The light was beginning to shift toward gold. Shadows lengthening across the ground. The clock had started, and from this point onward, every action or delay would write itself into the outcome. If assistance came quickly, there was a narrow path to survival. If not, the injuries, the heat, and the relentless drain of energy would make the decision for him. ChatGPT said, "The moment the vet arrived, the air seemed to grow heavier with the knowledge of what needed to be done." Daniel stood a few paces from the lion, his eyes fixed on the slow rise and fall of the animal's chest. The gashes along the flank were darker now, edges swollen, the skin hot and taut with inflammation. Flies lifted and settled in restless clouds, drawn to the dampness of the wounds, and with each small twitch of the lion's tail, they scattered only to return again. The limp in the rear leg was still visible even in stillness, a tense, protective curl, as though the body remembered the moment of injury and refused to forget. Daniel and the vet exchanged only the barest words, a quiet acknowledgement of the urgency that infection brought. The sedation dart was prepared quickly, the slender cylinder of steel and plastic holding the delicate balance between safety and control. At Daniel's nod, the vet stepped into position, aiming with care, and the dart struck with a soft thud, startling the lion's head into a brief, sharp lift. The muscles tensed, a ripple running through the frame. Then the tension eased as the sedative began its slow, measured work. Within minutes, the great body sank lower against the dust, breaths steady but shallow. Daniel moved in then, crouching near the injured side, his shadow falling across the torn flesh. The first touch of gloved fingers to fur was careful, tracing the matted hair before clearing it away to see the full depth of the damage. Warm saline was poured slowly, and rivulets ran into the earth, carrying with them grit and dried blood. The lion's flank rose faintly beneath Daniel's hands, each breath timed and monitored, his other hand resting lightly against the rib cage to feel for any irregularity. The wounds were deep, some edges already rimmed with pale tissue where infection had begun to root. Daniel knew that every hour without cleaning and treatment would allow the bacteria to spread further, into muscle, into blood. The vet passed instruments without a word, and together they worked to clear debris. Small stones, brittle grass stems, the fine dust of the savanna that had settled inside the open flesh. The lion's ear flicked once under sedation, a tiny, involuntary sign of the body's awareness. Daniel kept his movements unhurried, never pulling at the skin, never letting the cold of the saline shock the tissue. The fur around the wounds was clipped away, leaving a ring of bare, exposed skin that looked raw under the fading light. Each cut was flushed until the water ran clear, and the vet began applying the antibiotic ointment in measured strokes, working from the deepest gash outward. Daniel steadied the lion's rear leg, noting the swelling in the joint and the faint heat that suggested a separate injury, perhaps a strain from the original struggle or from limping for days afterward. The decision was made to inject a broad-spectrum antibiotic, followed by an anti-inflammatory to ease both pain and swelling. "Almost there," Daniel murmured, barely above a whisper, more for the rhythm of his own focus than for any other purpose. They worked as the air cooled around them, the long shadows of the grass stretching toward the horizon. Every so often, Daniel glanced at the lion's chest to reassure himself that the breathing was still strong, steady. In his mind, he kept returning to the thought of what had happened before this moment. The fight, the chase, perhaps a rival male or an encounter with prey that had turned defensive. Whatever it was, it had left this animal on the edge, a single thread holding him between life and collapse. The cleaning was slow because it had to be thorough. Missing even one embedded fragment could undo everything in the days to come. The vet began the final step, a careful spray of antiseptic, and the sharp scent lingered in the cooling air. The wounds were left uncovered, as nature's own airflow and dryness would serve better here than bandages in the heat. By the time the last instrument was packed away, the light had softened into the pale gold of late afternoon. The sedation would wear off within the hour, so Daniel and the vet stepped back, allowing space for the lion to wake without pressure. They stood in quiet observation, watching for the first signs of returning awareness, the faint twitch of a paw, the shifting of whiskers. Flies circled at the edge of the treated wounds but found less purchase now, deterred by the medicated scent. Infection was not gone, but it had been given a fair fight. For now, the lion's body had been given the best chance it could have, and all that remained was to watch the slow return to consciousness, ready to step back if the animal chose to rise in sudden instinct. In the last of the daylight, dust swirled gently over the treated fur, and the grass swayed in the cooling breeze as the land itself seemed to pause for the fragile, uncertain hours ahead. Under the dim wash of moonlight, the air around the ranger station was still and dry, carrying only the faint rustle of leaves in the acacia trees. The makeshift pen, built from strong wooden posts and wire mesh, stood in a pocket of soft dirt behind the station, shielded from the open plains by a curtain of brush. Inside, the injured lion lay stretched on his side, his chest rising and falling in slow, uneven rhythms. The sedative had worn thin, leaving him drowsy but wary. The flick of his tail the only sign that he remained aware of every sound around him. The deep wounds along his flank had been cleaned earlier, the edges raw but free from the heavy crust of infection that had threatened to take hold. Each breath carried a faint, dry rasp, a reminder that time was working against them. Daniel stood at the edge of the pen, hands resting on the top rail, watching for signs that the lion might try to rise. A small metal bowl of water had been set near the animal's head, the surface catching the reflection of the lantern light. The lion's eyes, half-lidded, shifted once toward it, then back to the ground, unwilling or too weak to move. Daniel stepped quietly inside, his boots pressing softly into the dust, and crouched a few meters away, his posture low and unthreatening. "It's here if you need it," he murmured, his voice no louder than the whisper of the wind, then eased back, giving the lion space. Through the night, the pen became its own small world, enclosed and separate from the vastness of the surrounding land. The quiet was broken only by the occasional grunt from the lion as he shifted his weight, the scuff of his paws against the dirt, and the distant bark of jackals. Daniel kept his position nearby, sometimes seated on a low stool, sometimes pacing slowly along the fence, scanning the animal for any sign of agitation or collapse. He had placed a canvas tarp over one side of the enclosure to create a patch of darkness and cool air, knowing that even under the moon, the heat could drain an injured animal's strength. The lantern's glow faded with the hours, replaced by the softer silver light of the night, and still the lion remained where he was, his breathing steady but shallow. Every so often, his ears would twitch toward some unseen movement outside the pen, the instinct to track and assess never dulled by injury. The water sat untouched. Daniel understood what that meant, that the lion's reserves were dangerously low, and that without hydration, infection, and exhaustion would work faster. The priority was simple: keep the animal calm, keep him stable, and hope the drive to live would return before dawn. He checked the wounds once more under the pale beam of a flashlight, careful not to linger too long in the pen. The cleaned edges had not reopened, but faint swelling had begun around one of the deeper gashes. It would need to be watched closely. Beyond the fence, the bush was silent in a way that only happened when large predators were near. The night felt both protective and fragile, like a thin shell around the life they were trying to hold on to. At some point after midnight, the lion shifted again, rolling partly onto his chest. His forelegs trembled as he tried to lift his head, the muscles along his shoulders quivering from the strain. His gaze caught the water bowl, and for several long seconds he remained frozen, deciding. Then, with slow, halting movements, he crawled forward just enough to lower his muzzle to the surface. The sound of his tongue breaking the still water was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Daniel's shoulders drop in relief. The lion drank in short bursts, pausing to breathe, then drank again until the bowl was half empty. It was a small act, but it marked a shift, a choice to take in what he needed to survive the next stretch. For the rest of the night, Daniel kept his vigil, noting the animal's breathing, the occasional twitch of his paws, the way he settled more evenly into the dirt after drinking. The risk was far from over. If the lion refused food in the morning, his strength would falter again, and recovery might slip out of reach. But for now, there was a thread to hold on to. Beyond the pen, the horizon began to pale, the first signs of morning pressing gently against the dark. The air cooled briefly before the coming heat, and a faint breeze stirred the dust along the fence line. In that stillness, the lion lay quiet, his head resting on his forepaws, the steady rhythm of his breath marking the slow, fragile return of strength. ChatGPT said, by the time the second day's light stretched over the reserve, the air was cooler than it had been in the tense hours before dawn. The lion lay in the shade of the low timber wall of the pen, his flanks rising and falling in shallow but steadier breaths. Daniel stood just outside the mesh, one hand resting against the rough post, his eyes fixed on every movement. For long hours through the night, there had been nothing but stillness, the kind that makes the air feel heavy and the mind count minutes as if they are fragile things. Now, in the muted morning light, a tremor ran through the lion's tail, slight but undeniable. The dust at its tip shifted, catching the light for a second before settling again. It was the first sign of returning strength, a signal that the body was trying, however slowly, to reclaim control. Daniel didn't move closer, didn't speak. Any change in position, any unnecessary sound, could drain what little energy the animal had managed to gather. He simply waited, noting how the lion's ears twitched toward distant bird calls, how his nostrils flared at the scent of the morning air. Around the pen, the ground was still damp from the careful trickle of water poured nearby to keep the dust down and the air cool. The scent of wet earth mixed with the faint metallic tang of healing wounds. Each time the lion shifted his weight, a ripple passed across his shoulders, the muscles still weak but responding to instinctive adjustments. A half-hearted lift of the head came next, followed by a pause that stretched into stillness again. The effort had cost him, but Daniel saw the intent in the movement. The lion had wanted to see beyond the wooden edge of his enclosure. That urge to orient, to measure the space, was another sign worth noting. He crouched to the lion's eye level, keeping his body language loose, his breathing slow. "Easy now," he murmured, almost inaudible, the sound more for rhythm than meaning. Minutes later, the lion tried again. This time, the forelegs stiffened. Paws pressing into the ground as his shoulders lifted a few inches before the weight pulled him back down. The attempt ended with a soft huff, the kind of sound that is part breath, part resignation, but it left a faint indentation in the soil where the claws had dug in. It was enough. Movement meant circulation, meant the body was beginning to fight for itself. Yet Daniel knew that each trial came with risk. A surge of effort could open wounds, strain muscles not yet ready for load, or trigger exhaustion severe enough to undo hours of quiet recovery. The balance was delicate. Too much push could tip the scale toward failure. The lion lay still again, sides moving in steady rhythm, eyes half closed but not in the blank way of collapse. Instead, they followed the shifting light, tracking it across the pen floor. Every few moments his ears pivoted toward Daniel's steps or the faint rustle of leaves beyond the fence. The tail flickered once more, quicker this time, sending a light arc of dust into the air. Daniel refilled the shallow water dish inside the pen, careful to place it close enough for the lion to reach without strain, then stepped back to the outer shade. The sound of water touching the metal rim drew the lion's attention. His gaze shifted, the nostrils flaring again. He did not move toward it yet, but the focus itself was another signal. Awareness was returning alongside strength. The sun rose higher, heating the edge of the pen, but inside, the shaded ground remained cool. Hours passed in this measured way, the lion resting, shifting, testing a paw or lifting his head, each movement separated by long spells of stillness. Mid-afternoon, Daniel saw the moment he had been waiting for. Without warning, the lion braced both forelegs, pressed up, and lifted his chest from the ground. His back legs followed, awkward and slow, the haunches trembling under the weight. He stood for a heartbeat, swaying slightly. The fur along his belly dark where it brushed the damp earth. Then, with careful precision, he stepped once, twice, each paw placing itself almost silently on the soil. 3 paces carried him to the water, where he lowered his head and drank. Not in great, desperate gulps, but in slow pulls, each one deliberate. It was the clearest sign yet that the body's systems were beginning to align with survival. Daniel stayed still, letting the moment stretch unbroken. The lion's ears flicked once toward him, then returned to neutral. When the animal had finished, he turned back toward the patch of shade, lowering himself again with visible control. The effort left him breathing harder, but there was no collapse this time, no long recovery before settling. For Daniel, these were the victories that mattered. A flick of the tail, a step toward water, the slow but certain engagement of muscle and will, each one marking the difference between holding on and letting go. Outside the pen, the air had grown heavy with the late light, the distant shapes of grazing antelope moving across the horizon. Daniel leaned against the fence post, his gaze steady on the lion, knowing the road ahead was still uncertain but no longer silent. In the quiet, the only sound was the faint stir of wind through the grass, carrying the scent of the open plains beyond. After 7 days of constant care, the lion's body had regained enough strength to stand without swaying for long, enough to lift his head without the weight pulling it back down, enough to fix his eyes on the open space beyond the enclosure's fence as if he knew there was something waiting there. The wounds had closed over in places, new skin stretched pale and fragile across them, the edges of the worst cuts still raw but no longer bleeding. His breathing, once shallow and rattling, had grown deeper, steady except for the occasional hitch when he shifted his weight. Daniel watched from the side as the transport crate was eased from the trailer and lowered onto the ground at the edge of the deep plains section of the reserve. This was not an open release into the unknown, but a calculated return into a part of the land where the risk was lowest. Far from the dens of rival males, far from the territory markers of lions that might challenge a weakened newcomer. The air here smelled of baked earth and the faint sweetness of dry grass heads swaying under the sun. The horizon rippled with heat, the sky pale and vast, a line of acacia trees breaking it far in the distance. The lion stood inside the crate, his muscles drawn tight, his gaze fixed forward. The shift of his tail was deliberate. Once, twice, a flick against the crate wall as if measuring the moment. When Daniel gave the quiet nod, the latch slid back and the door opened. For several long seconds the lion did not move. Then, with a slow, stiff step, he placed one paw onto the earth. It sank slightly into the dry soil, claws just visible as they gripped. Another step followed, the limp clear but the movement holding more purpose than hesitation. The sun caught the faint dust lifting around his paws, clinging to the edge of his mane. He paused to listen, ears swiveling, eyes scanning the empty stretch, then moved again, faster this time, though not yet with full strength. Each meter carried him further from the vehicle, the rangers, the days of confinement. Daniel watched his gait settle into something smoother, the limp still present but less pronounced with each stride. There was no moment of looking back. The lion kept his head low, his body angled toward the grassland ahead. In a few more lengths, his tawny shape merged with the dry grass until only the ripple of movement gave him away, and then not even that. The wind pressed the grass down where he had passed, leaving only a faint shifting path that the next breeze would erase. Daniel let the silence fill the space where the lion had been, then stepped back from the empty crate. The sun was lowering, its light turning the land to gold, the horizon beginning to blur under its glow. Somewhere ahead, the lion moved unseen, carrying the risk and the hope of survival into the wide, indifferent plains. The dry season's light lay soft over the reserve, pressing a pale haze against the horizon as Daniel's vehicle moved along the uneven track. Days had passed since the release, yet the memory of the lion stepping into the grass still lingered with an unfinished edge. Patrols at this hour were quiet, the kind of quiet where the wind worked low through the thorn bushes and every bird call carried. Dust lifted in muted spirals behind the tires, settling back to the ground in slow, patient descent. The air smelled faintly of baked earth, and somewhere far off, the cough of a kudu carried through the stillness. Daniel scanned the line where the pale grass met the sky, his eyes moving by habit over familiar shapes, looking for movement. He had not expected to see him again. The lion was a shadow at first, a dim figure against the flat light, barely breaking the stillness of the plains. There was no mistaking the heavy build, the faint hesitation in the gait, a trace of the limp that marked him even in the distance. Daniel slowed the vehicle. The animal was alone, the vast sweep of land behind him open and silent. Instead of drifting away as most lions did when approached, the great male changed his angle, walking directly toward the sound of the idling engine. Each step was deliberate, measured, the weight of his paws pressing the grass low before it rose again behind him. A light breeze shifted the mane around his neck, and the healed scar on his side caught the sun in a pale arc. Daniel stayed still, hands resting loosely, knowing sudden movement could break the lion's approach. The lion stopped within a few meters, the distance close enough that Daniel could see the slow rhythm of his breathing, the way his chest expanded against the pull of healed muscle. For a moment, there was only the shared space, no engine noise, no shifting air, just the steady lock of eyes. They were not pleading or fearful, only present, fixed in a calm that seemed to weigh and measure the moment. The wind passed once more, flattening a strip of grass between them. Daniel did not move, not even when the lion's head dipped slightly, gaze sliding away toward the vast line of the plains. Then, without sound, the lion turned, stepping back the way he had come, the limp slight but still there, folding into the rhythm of his stride. He moved with the same unhurried certainty as the day he was released, the tall grass swallowing his form until only the sway of the stalks marked his path. The land closed over the space he left, returning to its patient silence, and Daniel sat for a moment longer, the image of the scar, the mane, and the steady walk fixed against the pale horizon before the vehicle rolled forward again into the wind. The days moved on with the same slow rhythm of the plains, each morning spilling pale light over the grasslands, each evening drawing the horizon into shadow. Patrols continued, the work of watching and recording never stopping, but in the quiet intervals between duties, Daniel often found his thoughts returning to that day when the lion had approached, closing the space between them with steady, unhurried steps. He had not expected to see him again, and in truth, he never did. The lion was absorbed once more into the vastness of the reserve. Hidden somewhere in the folds of grass and scattered acacia, his path dictated by the pull of prey, the instinct to roam, and the quiet laws of survival that left no space for sentiment. Still, the image lingered. The rough line of his mane, not yet fully darkened with age, the slow lift of his head in the sunlight, the way the dust caught in the curve of his whiskers. It was not a memory weighted with gratitude or longing, but something far simpler, the recognition of another life moving with equal urgency through the same shared landscape. Daniel remembered the pause that had hung between them, the short distance at which neither advanced nor retreated, and how, in that narrow moment, it had felt as though neither man nor lion needed to be explained to the other. There had been no sound except for the grass folding in the wind, no other movement save for the rise and fall of a rib cage that had once heaved with pain and now seemed steady. The lion's eyes had been neither soft nor hard, but direct, unflinching in a way that belonged entirely to the wild. And then he had turned, a single deliberate movement, and walked back toward the plains without urgency, his tail swaying loosely behind him as the distance closed over his shape. Daniel's work continued, as it always did, yet the landscape itself seemed altered in a small, quiet way, as if that shared pause had left a faint line drawn across it, invisible but present, like the faint scent trail of a lion's passing long after the body has gone. He never spoke of the moment except once, quietly to a colleague, and even then only in passing, as if naming it too much might dilute what had been unspoken. The risk to the lion's survival remained, as it did for all predators here, injury, competition, scarcity, yet knowing this made the memory sharper, not softer. It was a reminder that both their courses had bent for a brief time toward the same point, and then, just as naturally, moved apart again. Long after, when the light fell low over the grass and the wind carried the scent of rain from the hills, Daniel would sometimes find himself glancing toward the horizon, not expecting to see that tawny shape break the line, but holding the thought that it might have happened. And that would have been enough. In the quiet space left behind, the moment stayed as it was, still, complete and unaltered by time. Prompt, hyper-realistic close-up of a tiny rescued baby monkey, fur damp from rain, wrapped snugly in a slightly worn wool blanket, delicate hands gripping the fabric, huge, tearful eyes gazing upward, cradled in the gentle, calloused hands of a wildlife ranger in a weathered khaki jacket, background softly blurred with lush, rain-soaked jungle foliage, mist drifting between leaves, raindrops glistening in soft, diffused light, captured with an 85mm prime lens, ultra-detailed National Geographic rescue photography style.